Great. Well, it is so good to be here with you all this morning. And, this is going to be fun. You got to meet my better half last night. Although, actually, I'm not sure my in-laws would agree with that statement. It was our anniversary last year, and we're on the phone with Vince's dad. And he basically just goes off in this long spiel about, Joe, we are so happy. The day you joined our family was like the best day we've ever had. You're the daughter we always wanted. You're amazing. You're fantastic. And just kind of goes on and on. And finally, he takes a breath and he goes, and Vince is like, great, now it's my turn. And he goes, you really hit the ball out of the park when you married Joe. As for my mother-in-law, the first time I met her, I'd been in New Jersey for about 3 days before she comes up to me in the kitchen one evening. She just gives me this giant mama bear hug, and she just goes, Joe, you are so great. You're like Miss America. And I never called any of Vince's other girlfriends that. To be honest, I still don't really know what it means to be Miss America, but I'll take it. It sounds great. My in-laws, they're amazing. They are super affectionate, and they're also very direct. In fact, it was one of my very direct conversations with my in-laws, a cousin-in-law called Stephanie. She's a lawyer in New Jersey that happened not long after we met. And Stephanie, she just told me outright that she could never become a Christian because the Bible is just too sexist. And I know that Stephanie, she is by no means alone in her thinking. I meet men and women all the time who feel exactly that same way. Maybe some of you are here this morning. I certainly remember struggling with that question myself when I was a teenager growing up in the church. And I can remember the first time that I ever read the novel, The Great Gatsby. And these words of Daisy Buchanan, they just lodged in my mind as Daisy has this to say about her daughter. She says, I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool. And as I read, I can remember seriously questioning if that was all God intended for me as well, whether my purpose was just to be ornamental and decorative, to be seen but never heard. And I think right this moment, we are living in a world that is an uproar over this very same sentiment, with many women today feeling not just unheard, but unseen. And my question for us this morning is this. In a culture where our headlines are so often dominated by bad news for women, what kind of news does the Bible bring? This question has never felt more pressing to me than it did last spring when I was giving a talk on the campus of UC Berkeley, and it just so happened that I was giving a talk on the same day as International Women's Day. Now, as you can imagine, in a place like Berkeley, the birthplace of the free speech movement, International Women's Day is a big deal. All over campus that day, there were women who were out protesting and yelling. There were signs and slogans and banners and marches and kind of just a real feeling of hurt and anger across the campus that day. But right in the middle of this really hectic scene, on the main thoroughfare of campus, there stood a girl. And she was wearing fishnet tights and a very short skirt, and she was topless, and she was just wearing a paper bag over her head with only little holes cut out for her eyes. And you could tell that people didn't really know what to make of this very public spectacle. Some people clearly just felt so uncomfortable that they just reacted by laughing. They just laughed at her out of shock. And other people, they were obviously so nervous and uncomfortable that they just sort of cast their eyes down and they hurried on by. They just couldn't even look at her. But then, if you got close enough, if you approached the girl wearing the paper bag over her head, then you could see these words written across the top of the paper bag. All 5 of my rapists are getting away with it. And then you looked into her eyes, and they were just completely haunted. There are really no words to describe something like that. But as I stood looking at her, let's call her Rachel for the sake of privacy in this talk, but as I stood there looking at Rachel, I found myself wondering, what would Jesus Christ have to say to her? What would he have to say to somebody like her? But even in that moment, as I was looking at her and I reflected on that question, I was surprised that actually, even in the face of such despair, never in my whole life had I felt such an unshakable conviction that the God of the Bible is real, or so incredibly thankful to know him. And I felt that way for 4 reasons, which I'm going to talk to you about this morning. And the first reason is this, that it is God alone who grounds the intrinsic worth of every human person. Now, looking at some of your faces, when I told you that story, I could clearly see how bothered you were by it. And yet, from a purely naturalistic perspective, it's actually hard to justify why what happened to Rachel, to somebody that you don't even know, is such a big deal. After all, if our lives are just cosmic, evolutionary accidents, if we're nothing more than a collation of atoms, then on what basis do we assign value or significance to anybody? We talk about human rights, but what are we grounding those on? If we're just dancing to our DNA and the name of the game is survival, then why shouldn't we say that one life is of greater value than another, or that might makes right, or that it's every man for himself? In his haunting poem, The Conclusion, poet Steve Turner, he graphically points out the logical and harrowing consequences of this way of thinking. "My love," she said, "when all's considered, we're only machines. I chained her to my bedroom wall for future use, and she cried." By contrast, the Bible, it tells us a radically different story about who we are. And it does so right from the very first page, where we are told that God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. According to Christianity, you are not random, you are intentioned. You are no accident. You are made, and not just made by God, but made like God. And that is a value that cannot be stripped away from you, because it is intrinsically and permanently woven into you by the Creator of the universe. And note how the Bible specifically spells out for us that when we talk about these unique creatures who are made not only by God but like God, we're talking about both male and female. Gender, too, is part of God's creation plan, and he says that what he's made is very good. From our 21st century perspective, perhaps this declaration, it may not strike you as all that remarkable, but compare this statement to other ancient beliefs, such as these words from the 5th century Greek philosopher Plato, who was one of the greatest thinkers of one of supposedly the most advanced civilizations in the ancient world. Plato says this: "It's only males who are created directly by the gods and are given souls. Those who live rightly return to the stars, but those who are cowards may with reason be supposed to have changed into the nature of women in the 2nd generation. According to Plato, men alone are made directly by God, and the punishment for cowardly men is that their souls will be reborn as women." So, gentlemen in the room, you have been warned. And yet, in contrast to this, we're told at the very beginning of the Bible that not only are women like men fully human, but they too are made in God's likeness and thus equal before him. And I just find it so ironic that those who claim to be too feminist for Christianity, they actually rarely see that the very equality that they long for was first instituted by the very God that they are rejecting. There's just no other statement of gender equality like this in the ancient world, which makes sense of why we so instinctively grieve what happened to that woman at Berkeley, because what took place was a violation of the most sacred thing in the world, a human person. And yet at the same time, if the Bible's teaching about human worth is true, then it also means that no matter what happens, nothing can strip Rachel of her dignity or make her less than. Her worth will never be defined by anything that she's done or anything that's ever been done to her, but simply because she's made in the image of God and fiercely loved by Him. Secondly, God not only grounds human dignity, but as Ravi has already spoken to this morning, He's also the foundation for our morality. Now, once again, this idea, it just jars strongly with a naturalistic perspective according to which the laws of our universe are governed by physical rather than moral laws. In the words of Dawkins, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And this belief that there's no such thing as objective morality, it was certainly the predominant view of many of the students our team met on the campus of UC Berkeley last spring. And yet, at the very same time, I've never met students who I admired more for their absolute passion and commitment to social justice. You know, they wanted to fight what they saw as injustice, but the question was, how do you reconcile these two competing commitments? If there's no such thing as right and wrong, then why did they care so much about putting to right the world's wrongs? From the Christian perspective, however, it just makes sense that we would feel such absolute and unrelenting opposition to what happened to Rachel. Because if there is a moral lawgiver, then our outrage isn't just arbitrary, but it aligns with that true reality that there is such a thing as right and wrong, and that what happened to Rachel was wrong. It was objectively and abhorrently evil. The challenge, I think, for us as Christians today is that while only God may account for our morality, these days many are turning the tables by accusing the God of the Bible, and particularly the God of the Old Testament, of immorality, and not least in His treatment of women. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we can see why. After all, even as Christians, we will come across passages in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, that will strike us as shocking, if not sexist, from our modern perspective. But actually, I don't think it should surprise us that the Bible doesn't shy away from retelling stories that are genuinely distressing, stories that include rape, polygamy, incest, female oppression, and violence against women. But the question we have to be asking ourselves is, why are these stories included in the first place? Are they there to commend this kind of behavior, or are they there to condemn it in the strongest possible terms? The importance of not leaping to conclusions was a lesson that I learned for myself the first time I went to stay with my Italian-American in-laws in New Jersey. And I can remember I was sitting out on the back deck with Vince's great Uncle Big, and yes, he really is called Uncle Big, when I heard raised voices coming from inside the house. And so I looked back through the window to see Vince and his mum engaged in what looked to me like a screaming match. They were both bright red in the face. Their noses were about 1 inch away from each other, and their arms were gesticulating wildly. And what made the whole thing even more terrifying was that Vince's mum had been chopping garlic with this enormous kitchen knife, and so she was sort of holding it and waving it around, but when she really wanted to make her point more emphatically, she just turned and poked it straight into Vince's face. And so I'm thinking, oh my goodness, World War III has broken out in the Vitale household, and I'm going to have to run in and break this thing up and probably get skewered in the process. Now, thankfully, things calmed down, and Vince walked away, so I went after him because I wanted to know, is everything okay with your mum, or are we going to have to pack our bags and go back to England? And Vince just looked at me blankly, and he had no idea what I was talking about. And he reassured me that he and his mum, they were just having a perfectly pleasant conversation. And so I said, well, what about the raised voices and the hands and the knife waving? And he just laughed and said, Jo, that's just how Italian Americans talk to each other. And I couldn't believe how badly I'd misread a situation. What looked to me like a knife fight was in fact two Italian Americans just showing that they love one another. It just kind of blew my mind because I'm somebody who is used to traveling to different parts of the world, who'd grown up watching a lot of American TV, and who even speaks the same language, well, supposedly anyway. But yet I could still so badly misinterpret that situation and another culture. Now, my point is this. If I had that much trouble understanding Italian Americans living in New Jersey in the 21st century, how much more challenging should I sometimes expect to find understanding and interpreting ancient Near Eastern cultures from 3,000 years ago? When we step into the Old Testament, we are stepping into a wildly different world. And so we need to work hard to understand the cultural context of the text that we are reading. But when we do, they begin to make so much more sense. Let's just consider a couple of examples. The atheist Christopher Hitchens once accused the Bible of allowing God's people to buy a wife like he would buy a horse, as if a woman was more of a possession than a person. And in making that claim, Hitchens, he's referring to a common ancient practice known as offering a bride price. But once we take the time to do our historical homework, we learn that the purpose behind this tradition was not, in fact, to purchase a bride as if she were nothing but a possession, but rather it was intended as a way of honoring the bride, of declaring serious intentions towards her, and of bringing the two families together. A close parallel to the tradition would be the dowry system that we still find in India today, in this case when the bride's family give gifts to the groom's family. And yet in that case, nobody would suggest that the bride is buying the groom as if he were nothing but property. And in fact, in the Old Testament, the money that was given was specifically intended as a life insurance policy for the wife. And that money would be set aside so that if the husband ever abandoned her or she became a widow, she wouldn't be left destitute. You see, far from this being a practice of demeaning women, the intention behind the custom was actually to provide honor and protection for women. Consider another example from Deuteronomy 21, which outlines the treatment of female prisoners of war. If you notice among the captives a beautiful woman and you're attracted to her, you may take her as your wife. After she's lived in your house and mourned her father and mother for a full month, then you may go to her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. If you're not pleased with her, let her go wherever she wishes. You must not sell her or treat her as a slave, since you have dishonored her. Now, at first glance, I think we can all put our hands up and say this text makes for uncomfortable reading. But what is it actually saying? Well, firstly, that unlike in surrounding cultures in which women were considered the spoils of war, rape is banned in ancient Israel. Instead, if a man desired a foreign woman, he has to wait for a full month after the battle, both to ensure that he's not driven by short-term lust, but also to allow that woman time to grieve her parents and her old life. And after a period of time, the man may then take her as his partner, but only if he commits to marrying her. And in this way, the woman is welcomed into the Israelite community as a full family member with all of the status that entails. And finally, if he doesn't wish to go ahead with the marriage, he cannot sell her on as if she were property. Instead, he must set her free. And it was in 2014 that I was horrified to read in the news the pamphlet that Islamic State had released to give its soldiers guidelines for how they should treat their female prisoners of war. Now, the irony was that the Islamic State leaders had actually composed this document to try and restrain the way that their soldiers were treating the captive Yazidi and Christian women. And yet, amongst other things, the pamphlet states that in accordance with the Quran, it is permissible for the soldiers to have sexual intercourse with the female captives immediately upon capture, that she need not be taken as a wife, but only as a sexual slave, that it's permissible to sell her on or give her as a gift if he doesn't want her. And most horrifyingly of all, that intercourse is permitted even if she's not yet reached puberty. It was as I sat there shaking and reading that pamphlet that I was struck by how unbelievably compassionate these instructions actually are in Deuteronomy 21. The two perspectives couldn't be more different. One is a clear case of a horrendous abuse of power, whereas yet again, the intention of the God of the Bible is to afford every measure of protection and respect to women in a hostile and dangerous and broken world. And we see the same commitment to right the wrongs of ancient culture against women carried over from the Old into the New Testament. As it so happens, actually, by the 1st century AD, attitudes towards women in Palestine had actually become more rather than less oppressive. So much so that, as one 1st century Jewish historian writes, the woman, says the law, is in all things inferior to the man. Now, this was the world that Jesus grew up in. And yet this comparison only makes his own attitude towards women all the more remarkable. I have a goddaughter called Mia. And when Mia was 3 years old and she was in the middle of her Disney princess phase, she went up to her dad one day and she said to him, "Dad, did you know that Mummy is a queen and I'm a princess?" And so her dad immediately sarcastically responds, "Oh, does that make me king then?" To which Mia replied, "Don't be silly, Daddy. Jesus is king. You're just a boy." Wow, right? I was so proud of her. So proud. Only 3 years old, and she not only has excellent theology, but she's already learned how to deflate her dad's ego in 3 seconds flat. My point is this. Jesus never tells me that I'm just a girl. Far from it. For example, the influence of Greek culture on Jewish thought at that time had led to the widespread belief that women succumbed to sexual temptation far more easily than men, and therefore to catch sight of a beautiful woman was to find yourself in grave danger. As one Jewish law code actually later stated, it's more dangerous to walk behind a woman than it is to walk behind a lion. And it was in that culture that if a man was sexually immoral with a woman, then it wasn't the man who was blamed for crossing the line, but actually it was the woman on account of her powers of seduction that led him astray. And it seems kind of tragic that 2,000 years have passed and we're still tangled up in our culture in those same painful arguments. And yet it was into that context that Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount, in which he turns these cultural assumptions completely on their head when he says, "But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Any man who heard Jesus speak those words would have fallen off his chair, because Jesus is teaching the exact opposite of what his culture affirmed. Far from blaming women, Jesus' challenges here is to recognize that actually lust, it originates in our own hearts, and we need to take responsibility for it. And we're called to a higher standard of seeing other people not as sexual objects, but as human beings equally made in the image of God. Given today's public discourse around female opportunity, Jesus' attitude towards female education is also striking, particularly when he lived at a time when the education of women was so strongly discouraged that Jewish law stated if any man gives his daughter a knowledge of the law, it's as though he taught her lechery. It's as though he taught her wrongdoing. And yet, when Martha summons her sister Mary away from where Jesus is teaching in their home and back into the kitchen, Jesus actually prevents Mary from leaving. Instead, he says that Mary has chosen what is better and that it won't be taken away from her. The text even describes Mary as sitting at Jesus' feet, a well-known symbolic statement for that time, as anyone who sat at the feet of a rabbi was counted among his most honored and closest disciples. In fact, far from stifling the voices of women, Jesus even allows women to be the first witnesses to his resurrection at a time when the testimony of women was considered so unreliable, it wasn't even taken as valid in a Jewish court of law. And yet Jesus allows the credibility of his resurrection, the most significant historical event of all time, to rest upon their witness. Time and again, throughout the Gospels, we see Jesus Christ going up against culturally oppressive attitudes towards women and overturning them. And yet his commitment to putting wrongs to right, it doesn't stop there. Leading us to the third reason why I believe the Bible is such good news for every one of us, male or female. Because in a world that is in turmoil over sexual abuse and where 100,000 women and girls are trafficked across international borders into sexual slavery every year, and the average age of those being trafficked is 12 to 14 years old, there is still a God who can offer ultimate justice. While I deeply respected the cries for justice displayed by many of the protesters on International Women's Day, at the same time, as I was watching all of these wounded and hurting women, I couldn't help but feel a kind of deep sadness, a sadness because at the end of the day, all it took was one look at Rachel hidden beneath that paper bag to realize that whatever progress we might make as human beings, it will never be enough. It's never going to be enough because our issues go so much deeper than any legal or political or social remedy can fix. Our issues run all the way down to the problem that Jesus himself identified in his Sermon on the Mount, the problem within ourselves, the problem of the human heart. This is a problem that the atheist political philosopher John Gray, he recognizes in his essay, Humanism and Flying Saucers, in which he argues with brutal honesty that to put your ultimate hope in humanism, in the progress of humanity, is as irrational as founding a religion on a belief in flying saucers. As he writes, civilization is natural for humans, but so is barbarism. For modern humanists, the solution is simple. Human beings must in the future be more reasonable. These enthusiasts for reason have not noticed that the idea that humans may one day be more rational requires a greater leap of faith than anything in religion. Since it requires a miraculous breach in the order of things, the idea that Jesus returned from the dead is not as contrary to reason as the notion that human beings will in future be different from how they have always been. According to Gray, it's a greater leap of faith to ground your hope in humanism than it is to put it in God. Why? Because although a commitment to take action to bring about social justice, it is a worthy and critical task, ultimately, we can't expect external solutions alone to fix internal problems. In the words of the Russian author Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who spent 8 years in a Soviet labor camp in the 1940s, if only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them off from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil, it cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? The rebellious nature of our hearts was something that Jesus Christ understood well. And we see him grieving it when he looks out at the city of Jerusalem and identifying with the protective instincts of a mother, he laments, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those sent to her. How often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks, but you would not." And with these words, Jesus actually foretells his own fate. And yet, even knowing what lies ahead of him, he doesn't falter. Why? Because although human justice will fall short, Jesus Christ was unwavering in his commitment to the cause of divine justice. And that's exactly what the cross symbolizes to us, the most profound statement God could have made, that we are not okay, that our lives so badly contradict the way he desires for us to live, that he's not just going to sweep it all under some divine cosmic carpet, but the only fitting judgment for the ways that we demean and dehumanize and abuse and violate and destroy one another is death. It's a judgment so serious it cost the Son of God his life. And I think for those of us who've never been the victims of extreme and severe injustice, perhaps the judgment, it may seem too severe to us. But to the woman standing with a paper bag over her head, proclaiming that all 5 of her rapists are getting away with it, God's commitment to justice, a commitment that we see running right through the Bible, all the way from the Old to the New Testament and culminating at the cross, is a hope for her to hold on to. The hope that no matter how badly wronged she has been, God will ensure that justice is served and the judge of all the earth will do what is right. And likewise, there will be some of you here, even today, you've been treated very badly. And that matters to God. It really matters to him. It matters so much that God not only committed to judging sin, but moving to our final reason, ultimately the good news of Christianity for all of us, women and men alike, is this: that no matter how defaced or dehumanized we have been made to feel, no matter what kind of bag or mask we might wear over our heads, there is a God who sees right to the heart of us. A God who looked on Rachel at Berkeley with such compassion in her harassed and helpless state that in the person of Jesus Christ, he willingly chose to come and to live a human life and to suffer alongside of her, to be stripped naked and exposed like her, to endure public ridicule and shame like her, to become one from whom men hide their faces, to know what it's like to wear nothing but shame and to endure unimaginable violence and isolation and suffering, all because he couldn't bear to stay off at a distance while she was hurting, but instead, out of love, he came to suffer alongside her. I think it's symbolic of the cultural mess that we are in right now, that we live in a society where Hugh Hefner is still celebrated as a hero, where 50 Shades of Grey is a bestseller, and yet where the Me Too hashtag is trending all at the same time. And somehow all of these realities, they coexist together. And yet if you're wondering where we find God in all of this chaos, then we just don't need to look any further than the cross. In the words of Joshua Harris, the world takes us to a silver screen on which flickering images of passion and romance play, and as we watch, the world says, "This is love." God takes us to the foot of a tree on which a naked and bloodied man hangs, and he says, this is love. And it was on that day at Berkeley, as soon as she laid eyes on Rachel, that one of my teammates at RZIM, called Madeline Jackson, she just had the overwhelming sense of God saying to her in that moment, out of everybody here on this campus today, I identify with her. I'm here for her. And so Madeline approached Rachel. And as she approached her, she began to share with her just some of the things that I've shared with you this morning. And as she did, Rachel just began to weep. And as she wept, she just threw her arms around Madeline and she just clung to her so tightly. And then Madeline asked if she could pray for her. And Rachel said yes. And so they stood there holding hands in the middle of that crazy scene with everybody walking by, staring on and just wondering, like, what on earth is going on? But that was the moment that Rachel discovered that there is a living God who looks on her with love, a God who doesn't see her as a label or as a mask or as shame, but who sees her as his child, as his daughter. And it's the same God who sees every single one of us as well, a God who sees us as immeasurably valuable, a God who stands opposed to evil, a God who is committed to justice for the victim, and a God who loves us so much, male and female, that he would willingly lay down his own life to give us a new one. In Luke chapter 7, we hear about a woman who lives in a town that has labeled her a sinner. That's what she's known as. The whole town just knows her as the sinner. And when this woman finds out that Jesus is coming to town, she finds out the house where he's being hosted, and she kind of charges in, uninvited, gate crashes, and she just flings herself down at Jesus' feet, and she begins to weep. And then as she's weeping, she begins to wash his feet with her tears and wipe it with her hair. And then she pours out perfume, all her wealth in the world, all over his dirty feet. And then she begins to shower them with kisses from a mouth that everyone saw as unclean. As this scene is going on, Jesus turns to Simon the Pharisee, whose home he's in, and who is watching this scene, horrified and judgmental, and making all sorts of assumptions about who Jesus must be to allow a woman like that to touch him. And then Jesus asks Simon this really poignant question. Do you see this woman? Do you see this woman? And I just wonder if that is a question for some of us here this morning. We live at a time in our culture where we are wrestling with a lot of questions around this subject in a very public way. But are we capable of looking beyond the politics and the rhetoric and the statistics, beyond the yelling and the anger and the finger pointing, to see the people who are actually standing in front of us with pain in their eyes? Do we see this woman? And maybe for others of you today, the truth is that you are like this woman. Maybe you're here, male or female, but you're someone who you've just felt overlooked or downtrodden or just like a totally second-class citizen, and you just feel like, does anybody even see me at all? And if that's you this morning, I just want you to know that there is a God who sees you, a living God who looks on you with love and who will never turn his face away. And I find it so sad that my cousin Stephanie, she thinks that the God of the Bible is bad news for women. Because, personally, I've never met anybody like Jesus Christ, someone who is for me like that, a man who brings out the best in me and who loves me more than I could ever love myself. When I look at Jesus Christ, I see exactly the kind of man that I want to spend time with. And I see exactly the kind of God that it is a privilege to worship.